J. Ryan Williams. Dude, it's good to see you. I know we ended up talking for about 24 minutes in the green room, and it felt like we should have been
Hard to
recording that.
resist.
Yeah, it
Hard to
was really
resist.
hard. Um, how are you, brother? It's really,
I'm
again,
good,
really,
man.
I just want to give you this hug.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, hearing from you when I posted about my job change was just the warmest thing to hear. Hey, let's catch up. Let's do it on the pod. I got a note from you. I got a note from John Barrows, who I hadn't heard from for a couple years. Like, that's just the warmest thing, right? Like, let's make content together because we love content, but also let's just see each other, say hi, and reconnect, which is awesome. Because, when I first got into startups, you were very early in my network in San Francisco. And so uh, when I think you were at MoPub and then at Twitter, it's the same time I'm running around San Francisco, same time Max is starting Sales Hacker. And like we're running around through all these events trying to build our networks, trying to figure out how to drive enough value for the people around us that we can, really do this thing called the startup land. And it's just awesome that we are still in touch after all these years. And I'm very grateful for you and your support.
Well, congratulations. And I should say, a couple of things to that. I think a lot about those days because I do get these moments where I'm like, man, this FOMO kind of thing. Like,
Hmm.
what happened to that? Am I getting older? I'm, stuck to my LinkedIn feed all the time, seeing all these great
Yeah.
up and comers and people who even came after that have created new paradigms right on social and stuff like that. And so sometimes it's somewhat selfish for me to reach out to folks like yourself because it makes me feel good inside. It makes me
Mm,
feel like, oh, my
yeah.
my tribe, and I certainly remember those days. And I ping folks all the time. I'm just like, hey, how's it going? What's up? So the feeling is mutual for sure.
Yeah, good, good. Well, I always got an open door here.
The other thing that I think you and I have in common is this passion for the early stage, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, yes, we have been sales professionals and carried bags and operated teams and these sort of things, and certainly at that time when like sales tech was really kind of going through this renaissance, right? Like, sure, you can
Yeah,
consider CRM and so on from the late 70s and 80s with Sibo and Goldmine and all those early systems. But like, I think there was that moment that you were referring to about 15 years ago, give or take, that Salesforce had really established itself and then built out the ecosystem of applications that plugged into it, and then tools started to really be built for us, right? As
yeah.
those salespeople, and I think that we were doing that as a profession, but I think one thing that I've always felt close to you about was like you were in like the trenches with founders all over the world, the documentary, all the content. And as that was a passion of mine too, with the startups and edited stuff that I
Mhm.
attempted to do. And I remember you actually bringing it to life in a beautiful way, and packaging it was really, really cool. So I don't think I ever gave you a shout out for that. So shout out also for doing that, because like,
Thanks,
again,
man.
that's something that was really near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, we released the film and during 2020 or maybe early 21, so definitely movies were shut down, but to have a feature-length documentary is a big lift, so I got to see that kinda start to finish. We met probably 100 founders, traveled 150,000 air miles from Portugal to New Zealand to Uruguay and Mexico City, and then had our own startup struggles, in the end. And so, I think actually my co-founders recut a version of the film that may be re-released that tells a lot of our backstory and I don't know if it'll be the story of how we tried to start a company and failed, but it was definitely like an amazing ride to have all that travel. But and thinking about it, what attracted me to the early stage, both from where we worked back in the day in San Francisco, and then later as a mentor, advisor, and later an executive coach, that early stage is so interesting to me because I actually started my career as a teacher.
Mm.
I taught sixth grade social studies, sixth and seventh grade social studies, and so I love the idea of being around people who are learning, when I left college, I really missed being around people that are learning. That's the only reason I went to grad school, actually, is because I wanted to be back in that element where everybody was around somebody who was trying to learn something. And so then to take that to startups at the early stage, we're not just trying to learn, but we're also inventing the motion. Okay. And I always thought for me, that's the entrepreneurial like itch that's getting scratched is
Mm,
like we're creating something, we're building a structure where whether it's a new outbound sales motion, whether it's how to use SDRs, globally, whether it's how to outsource teams or now how to build content that's actually like converting people into the pipeline. I'm really attracted to that like scaffolding is what we call in education, where you can build something that starts to work and then you build on top of it. But it hit me as we've been talking about this that it's actually not just the early stage is interesting because that's where the learning is. The early stage is also interesting because there's so little structure that anyone can come to that party. That's why my film was called Outside the Valley.
mm,
And it was about great founders coming from everywhere. You're not more smart based on where you're born. You kidding me? You can run a company anywhere. Now, your access to capital is very different if you're in South America or you're in Portugal. Like your access to capital is very different in New Zealand as it would be if you were in California. 90% of venture capital stays in California and New
mm,
York. I think a lot of people don't realize that.
mm,
There are a lot of global unicorns, but 90% of capital is staying here in the US coast.
mm,
Founders in Miami can't access that the same way that founders in San Francisco can. But if you think about that early stage where anyone can show up to that party, anyone can create content, anyone can be on LinkedIn, anyone can come and network, that brings me all the way back to those like 2008, 2009 days in San Francisco. I went to a startup event and it wouldn't surprise me if you and I were there. Tell me if this sounds familiar. But I went to an event that looked like a science fair. There was 10 tables in a bar. Everybody got a beer for their entry ticket. And table one was a guy who was doing a new content management system. Table two was this guy who was doing an airplane share where you could like rent a piece of a private jet. That's weird. This is like 2010, right? That's weird, right? Next to him, this is probably maybe it was 2009 because next to him was a guy who said, "Yeah, I'm doing like the jet thing, but for limousines." And it was fucking Ryan Graves out there pitching the first version of Uber after they came from Chicago and started setting up in San Francisco.
that's awesome.
And like that kind of room was existing, and you had like Tony Comrade walking around telling everybody about.me and like trying to like build the single source for your profile on the internet. Like all these things, all these ideas are just coming out of this like world that anyone can come participate in. And back then it was you really had to be in San Francisco to do that. I'm glad that's not the case now, but when I think about the early stage and I think about the that Renaissance time that you and I met during, like it's cool that it was so entrepreneurial, but it's actually a lot cooler to think about the fact that now anyone can play the game. The resources are there. People like you who are putting education online, this podcast, etc. You can go learn it and try it and do it from anywhere, and that is just too cool.
I love that story. And I think one of the things you and I also discussed as we were catching up sort of via email was like this idea of just creating the stories that we should be telling, whether we're a
Yeah,
salesperson or a founder or ICs or leaders, right? Creating those personal stories. And you just showed kind of an example, right, of like real stories. We're not BSing, right? These are all like stories and experiences we're pulling from our experience. But how do you, if you're a founder or again that rep or that sales leader who's trying to teach your team to tell the stories, how do you start to craft that story in a way that's
yeah,
authentic, right? Because I think that's one of the things we're like, oh, let's put a brand story together, story for the product, these sort of things. And yeah, you could write something down, right? That, do some creative writing and these sort of things. But how do you actually do
yeah,
this in a way where it's again authentic and you actually believe it as you're communicating
yeah.
it?
I'm going to give you two kind of what I think are quick techniques. I don't like to say hacks, but here are two strategies that you can use right now, regardless of your level, regardless of your goal and your outcome, to start building video. Well, This works for any kind of content to get your story out, but I think video is one of the best mediums for it.
Yeah.
It's one of the best places to establish trust. It's the best way to connect with people because then it feels very real. They can see where you are, what your life is like. All right. So here are two quick things. If you're thinking I want to get into video, the first is to think about what you have to offer. And specifically, it's not just what do you have to offer, but when and where does somebody want the thing that you can offer? Right. So if I'm great at making snow cones, well, this is a great week to be good at making snow cones. It's very hot here in the US this week. Everybody's on heat warning. But if I'm great at making snow cones, but I live where I do in Seattle, like the rest of the year ain't that hot. If I was in Miami, different story. So, where are people and what do they need when they're trying to access this thing that I'm good at? And then let me build the story and offer that expertise to the people when they need it. Here's how it works in SaaS. Let's say the thing you know a lot about is that first step of deciding if you have a problem. I used to sell hotel software. The first step of deciding if your hotel has a software problem is around user experience. What's the digital user experience at your hotel? Now, we had SDRs who were like 10 minutes out of college sometimes, and for them to call themselves an expert would be really offensive to a 25-year career GM at a hotel. Except if they go and be an expert in that one little problem and that's what they talk about, that expertise is gold. Because who else do you know who's talked to 20 hotels in the last month about their digital engagement strategy? Not the GM who's out there doing the GM job. Okay, so that SDR can take all those stories and the CEO can do it if it's customer development stage too. Everywhere in between can do that. You have the stories. If I'm a VP of sales, I can start a video with here are 3 things that came up my sales meeting this week. If you're worried about sharing too much information about proprietary stuff at your team, record that video and just save it for 6 months. Go back and release it later. Okay, so that's kind of like quick tip number 1 is do your personal work on expertise. What is it that makes you an expert? It's not 10,000 hours. I don't think I've been in sales 10,000 hours. I've been around the ecosystem maybe that much. But what makes you an expert is not that you've been in it, but you've disproportionately witnessed the change that's going on in an organization. So if you're in sales, a lot of, if you had 20 conversations with people trying to decide if they've got a digital problem at their hotel, great. That's 20 more than most other people. If you've been at a company at least half of a sales cycle, you should be able to do something like that. And then you go from an SDR who's like begging for a deal to thinking about that power ratio changing, that power dynamic rather, is you are an expert, so you can offer that as expertise.
Hmm.
George, would you like to hear about how these 5 hotels in San Francisco are adopting a digital strategy? Would that be helpful for you to take to your GM meeting and share a little industry insight? Probably. Here's a video my CEO
Hmm.
did about this exact topic, right? Whether I'm loading into Asset Mule and sending it out, or I'm inviting people to my YouTube channel, or I'm embedding that story, or I'm writing that story on LinkedIn. All those are ways I can
Hmm.
share that. And that's information that like ChatGPT doesn't have. Like AI, there are a lot of great AI tools, but to know the personal antidote of like, here's why somebody adopted this thing. So I'm a little long-winded, but that's hack number 1. Number 2 is very simple, is if you think about why someone may or may not trust you, it really comes down to about 4 elements. This comes from David Meister's book, The Trusted Advisor, which every enterprise sales rep I know says trusted advisor, but they've never actually read the book, right? Many people don't know it. It's a phrase that comes from this book from like 20 years ago. And so David Meister and his team lay out these 4 elements of trust: credibility, what you know; reliability, what you do; intimacy, how you make people feel; self orientation, why are you doing it? Self orientation is why we don't trust somebody selling us a car. It's a big transaction with somebody we're never going to see again.
Hmm.
So we're naturally worried and fearful. But as soon as that person walks out and they go, look, I don't make commission here, so I'm just going to give you some advice, right? Or the sales rep who's on the phone with you and says, look, I know you're worried about me trying to close you. I don't think you're a good fit. So I'm going to tell you my straight advice on what you should do. Or or more accurately, a rep who goes, look, closing somebody who's not a good customer is not advantageous to me. It actually costs us a lot of time and energy. So I'm not going to bullshit you. Self-orientation changes that equation, right? Then it's, how do I make someone feel? Can I tell you enough about my personal situation or what's going on in the company so that I can create that intimacy bridge to make you safe to tell me what's going on with you, right? If anybody's ever like asked for help on a personal problem, they know that there's a little lump in your throat that happens depending on how you feel about it.
Mm.
But if you can be vulnerable with like that, maybe a tax advisor, you go, look, I know I really screwed things up. If they can make you feel safe to share that problem, right? And by the way, the guys that wrote the Trusted Advisor, they were talking about sales and business development for law firms,
Mm.
right? Like trusting your
Sure,
lawyer.
huge.
Exactly. Reliability. How do you show up? If you're showing up consistently through content, people can trust you. You see that from the big creators on LinkedIn. The big creators on LinkedIn, those are the people who are out there and they're doing it. They're posting every day. If they're posting every day, I know where to find them. If they're posting every week or insights or like, I think about my buddy Doug Landis. He doesn't post on LinkedIn every day. When he has something to say, it's always good.
Mm.
Boom, reliability score way up. Right. Same as when he was, as a VC, he was always writing great resources for his VC's website. Reliability score way up. And what you know is credibility, right? Can you share with me what you know? Um, it's really a turn off to have a 22-year-old SDR call an enterprise buyer who's 45 or 50 and says, I know everything about XYZ. You don't. You just can't. You invalidated my whole experience.
Mm.
But if you can tell me that one little thing that you know that you're a master of, maybe you learned it from customer discovery, maybe you learned it from some other activity, or you take me behind the scenes because you're comfortable with flicking that camera on when you're behind the scenes at whatever's going on. Like, hey, right now we're looking at the new dashboard. I wanted to tell you what it does. That's a behind the scenes shot. That's gold. That's access. Like documentary filmmakers know access to something that's not anywhere else, or even that feeling of access, that not only builds credibility, but that also creates an intimacy moment too.
Mm.
If you do two at one time and you do something that's like kind of embarrassing, like, hey, this feature doesn't work yet, but we're looking at it. Boom, you just change self-orientation, right? So there are your two kind of quick hacky type techniques. Acknowledge your expertise and do your personal work. And then also think about the trust equation.
I know we got 2 minutes and I got to go and pick up my son. That was perfect. I was just,
Was that too long of an answer?
no, that
I'm
was
kinda
perfect.
long-winded.
That was perfect. I was thinking like that, like this right now we're at about 17 minutes or so, or 18, whatever.
Yeah.
I was thinking like those are like gold. I'll send you the raw footage, which is basically this to do what, obviously whatever.
Yeah.
I do, man. I want to continue to talk to you. My wife will kill me if I'm late to drop him off to tutoring.
Don't
But
be late.
real
Can
quick,
I offer one final thought?
yes.
All right. For anybody listening who's thinking, I want to do video, or anybody who watches your stuff and says, how come George always has a cool podcast or cool project going on? If you're somebody who's camera shy, like right now, my kids are doing a stage production of The Wizard of Oz. And my 10-year-old just told me about how she's got stage fright, doesn't want to go to practice. If you got stage fright at practice, you're bummed, right? But here's a simple thing. If you got stage fright doing video, whether you're a sales rep, CEO, or whatever, the next time you get a text from your wife, your partner, your friends, respond with video. Whip out your phone and record, just like recording an audio message, record a video message. Just take your phone and say, hey, thanks so much. George, it's great to hear from you. I'd love to be on your podcast. Here's what's going on for me. Just record a quick video. Keep your eye contact right on where the camera is, that little top little circle. And you'll start to get used to hearing your own voice, condensing your thoughts down into 3 salient points or 4 salient points. Even if it takes you a few times to send that, you'll get really comfortable with the idea of being on video. And then you start sending it to other people. You start sending it to prospects. You start being able to respond by video. And now someone can look into your eyes and choose to trust you.